to the Worcester Senior Center Stay Connected programming on Channel 192. My name is Suki Lapin, and I am the program coordinator at the Worcester Senior Center. The Worcester Senior Center Distinguished Speaker Series in collaboration with the Worcester Jewish Community Center continues. This month, we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the woman's right to vote and the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Our guest speakers are Dr. Judith Rosenbaum, CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive, in conversation with Dr. Lisa Conley Cook. Tune in as Dr. Judith Rosenbaum and Dr. Lisa Conley Cook discuss the historical significance of the fight for suffrage, focusing on women's 19th century women's right movement, Jewish activism, and the enduring struggle for a political voice. This program will be moderated by Serena Lapin, who happens to be my daughter, Worcester Public Schools history and government teacher at Worcester's North High School. The 19th Amendment legally guarantees American women the right to vote. Achieving this milestone required a lengthy and difficult struggle. Victory took decades of agitation and protest. Beginning in the mid-19th century, several generations of women's suffrage supporters lectured, wrote, marched, lobbied, and practiced civil disobedience to achieve what many Americans considered a radical change to the Constitution. Few early supporters lived to see the final victory of ratification in the 1920s. Decades of struggle to include African Americans and other minority women in the promise of voting rights remained. Many women remained unable to vote long into the 20th century because of discriminatory state voting laws. In the wake of this incredibly important election year, we are honored to have this timely and important discussion broadcasted on our channel, created, produced, and executed by women for women. In the words of the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. I am honored to introduce my colleague and dear friend, Nancy Greenberg, Worcester's JCC Cultural Arts and Senior Adult Director. Nancy sits on the Commission on Elder Affairs and is one of the Worcester Senior Center's longtime collaborators.
Thank you, Suki. Judith Rosenbaum is the CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive, a pioneering digital archive and public history organization that documents Jewish women's stories, elevates their voices, and inspires them to be agents of change. An educator, historian, and writer, Judith earned a PhD in American Studies from Brown University with a focus on women, gender, and social movements. Judith teaches and lectures widely on Jewish studies and women's studies, and also serves on the faculty of the Bronfman Youth Fellowships.
Dr. Lisa Conley Cook received her doctorate in United States Women's History from Clark University in 2017. Her dissertation focuses on the history of U.S. feminism, specifically women's activism in community organizations, such as the women's suffrage movement, the Women's Club movement, and the YWCA. She is a co-founder and first president of the Worcester Women's History Project and is a professor of history and political science at Quinsigamond Community College. Please enjoy this program.
Thank you. I'm going to begin with a quotation. From the cradle to the grave, woman is subject to the power and control of man. Father, guardian, or husband, one conveys her like some piece of merchandise over to the other. Those are words that were spoken in October 1851 at the Women's Rights Convention in Worcester by Ernestine Rose. Ernestine Rose, who was a Jewish immigrant from Poland, was one of the early suffragists. The daughter of a rabbi, she herself was an atheist, although she spoke out boldly against anti-Semitism when it reared its head. She was an influential activist in her time, known for having an important role in Susan B. Anthony's own development as a suffrage activist. In addition to suffrage, Rose was also particularly active on issues of married women's property rights, and she helped lead the fight for women's property rights in New York State. Since Ernestine Rose's day, there have always been Jewish women in the struggle for women's rights and for voting rights. Because of the way the history of the suffrage movement has been written, Jewish women aren't always visible, or at least visible as Jews, but they are there, and I'm happy to have this chance to share some of their stories and impact with you today. One of the important things to understand about the suffrage movement is that it was never a unified or monolithic movement. It contained many different communities and organizations, and people of many different backgrounds and opinions about how best to achieve enfranchisement and equality for women. In the early years of the women's rights movement in the mid-19th century, suffrage was actually considered quite a controversial demand and almost wasn't included in the Declaration of Sentiments at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. But by the late 19th century, the battle for women's suffrage had become a more central piece of the struggle for women's rights, and organizations that pushed for women's suffrage were comprised of respectable middle and upper class women, including some Jewish women who had already assimilated into American society. This was also the same period of swelling immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, which ultimately brought about 2 million Jews to America with the promise of greater freedom and prosperity. These immigrant Jewish women also supported suffrage in large numbers, often because they believed that America could only live up to its ideals if women were allowed to have a political voice. For the middle-class Jewish suffragists, the suffrage movement was a way to be part of the American female practice of volunteerism and reform. This aspect of women's activism was framed as an extension of women's traditional roles in the home, a way to bring a kind of maternal caretaking to the wider society, even as it gave women a context to leave the home and to engage in the public sphere in new ways. With the power of the vote, these women argued, women would be able to, quote-unquote, clean up public affairs. Sometimes this was referred to as municipal housekeeping. For working-class Jews, who were often immigrants or the children of immigrants, the vote was seen through a more pragmatic lens. For them, it was the tool that activists needed to achieve their goals of improving the lives of workers with better pay or safer working conditions. Jewish women like Rose Schneiderman and Pauline Newman were known as lifelong labor activists, from their teen years as sweatshop workers to their later years as influential members of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's inner circle. But they also fought for women's suffrage, and they partnered with middle-class women and suffrage organizations because they knew that women needed the vote to influence legislation for workers' rights. There are so many wonderful stories of Jewish women suffragists, but I'm going to share just a few to give you a sense of the breadth and diversity of suffrage activism. Let me share. Maud Nathan was probably the best-known Jewish suffragist. She came from a prominent New York Jewish Sephardic family. She was related to the poet Emma Lazarus and to the Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Cardozo. Interestingly, her sister, Annie Nathan Meyer, though an important activist for women's education and a founder of Barnard College, did not support women's suffrage. Maud Nathan came to suffrage activism through her work with the National Consumers League, which she threw herself into to manage her grief after the death of her only child. She became a leader in the movement to educate consumers about the working conditions of women and children, and she argued that it was the consumer's responsibility to be aware of conditions in factories and sweatshops and to strive to be a responsible shopper on a daily basis. This brought her to suffrage because she realized that without the vote, women did not have real power to influence law and policy. Maud became a very powerful voice for suffrage, often writing essays and books, and her husband Frederick supported the cause as well and actually led the Men's League for Equal Suffrage. After Frederick died in 1919, Maud and her companion Corinne Johnson continued to work for the rights of working women, equal suffrage, and the education of consumers until her death in 1946. Anita Polliter was another prominent Jewish woman in the suffrage movement. She was originally from South Carolina, but became involved in suffrage while a student at Columbia University in New York. Soon after her graduation in 1916, she met Alice Paul and joined the National Woman's Party, which was the more militant of the two main suffrage organizations. This led to decades of activism. As an NWP organizer, she traveled throughout the U.S., helping to ratify the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. In 1917, she was among the Silent Sentinels who protested outside of Wilson's White House, and she was arrested for her activities. In August of 1920, Polliter helped to convince legislator Harry T. Byrne of Tennessee to cast the deciding vote for the amendment. After the ratification of the 19th Amendment, she remained involved in the movement, becoming vice chair of the World Women's Party with Alice Paul in 1933, and then in 1945 becoming Alice Paul's successor as chairwoman of the National Women's Party. And she remained active both in feminist politics and in the arts. She was actually a close friend of Georgia O'Keeffe's throughout most of her life. Another Jewish Carolinian who played a different role in the suffrage movement was Gertrude Weil. Weil was born in Goldsboro, North Carolina in 1879 to a family of prominent business leaders. She received a progressive education, which was unusual for a woman in her community at the time. She was the first North Carolinian to graduate from Smith College in 1901. And after her graduation, she returned home to Goldsboro and became involved in both Jewish community and in the women's club community. She became a significant suffrage activist in North Carolina, which at the time was really seen as going against Southern tradition. But in response to those arguments, Weil shrewdly based her pro-suffrage arguments on appeals to women's responsibility as moral guardians of the home. And although North Carolina ultimately didn't ratify the amendment, Weil continued to be a very strong force for activism in her state. She continued to be involved in women's organizations and in civil rights and in anti-lynching work throughout the rest of her life. Lest you think that Jewish suffragists were only on the East Coast, I want to introduce you to Belle Fliegelman Weinstein, who was a young Jewish woman from Montana who helped build the suffrage movement in her state in the 1910s. Belle attended the University of Wisconsin and served as the president of Women's Student Government Association, and she was actually the first female commencement speaker at the university. That was the time during which she got involved in the suffrage movement, and Wisconsin's state headquarters for women's suffrage selected her as a student representative to address a joint session of the state legislature. In 1914, when she returned to Montana after graduation, she helped launch the suffrage movement there. At the same time, she was working as the first woman reporter for the Helena Independent, and she was assigned to report on Jeanette Rankin's speech to the local Federation of Women's Clubs. After that experience, she became a devoted follower of Rankin, traveling with her and other suffragists throughout the state. Montana achieved women's suffrage in 1914. Again, it's important to remember that suffragists were pursuing both a state-by-state approach as well as a federal amendment. And after that, Belle continued to work with Jeanette Rankin, helping her be elected to Congress in 1916. She was the first woman in Congress and still the only woman elected to Congress from the state of Montana. And she followed her there to become her legislative secretary. Belle also pursued her own political career, running unsuccessfully for Montana Senate in 1932 under what I think is a terrific slogan, "Smaller but better senators." Like the other activists I've mentioned, Weinstein remained a dedicated activist, fighting for women's rights to serve on juries, for child labor law, and for the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, the women that I've mentioned thus far were all middle or upper class, and as I said earlier, there were also many working class Jewish women who worked for women's suffrage. So let's return to Rose Schneiderman. As a leader in the labor movement, Schneiderman saw the vote as a tool to improve working conditions and pay. She became an ardent suffragist, and she helped to found the Wage Earners League for Women's Suffrage along with her good friend from the labor movement, Clara Lemleth. They argued in speeches and pamphlets that women needed the vote in order to secure basic human rights like safe working conditions. She also, with her friend Pauline Newman, worked as a paid organizer for the National American Women's Suffrage Association. In 1912, Schneiderman toured Ohio to push for the Ohio suffrage referendum. And this was where she first coined her famous term, bread and roses, which describes the right of all people to both the basic necessities of life, the bread, and the things that make life meaningful and that provide dignity, like education, art, beauty. This was one of the insights that women brought to the labor movement, that they shouldn't only be fighting for bread, but also for roses. And the term bread and roses came up in a speech actually in the context of the women's suffrage campaign in 1912. This is what Schneiderman said to the women, the middle-class women she was meeting with. What the woman who labors wants is the right to live, not simply exist. The right to life, as the rich woman has the right to life, and the sun and music and art. You have nothing that the humblest worker has not a right to have also. The worker must have bread, but she must have roses too. Help, you women of privilege, give her the ballot to fight with. And when she returned to New York, she was instrumental in January of 1917 launching the final successful drive to win the vote for New York women. She really helped to bring out Jewish support for that campaign. Let me stop sharing. So despite the fact that the majority of Jewish women supported suffrage and many individual women, like those that I've just mentioned, played important roles, most American Jewish institutions were slow or hesitant to endorse the suffrage movement because of the anti-Semitism and xenophobia associated with it.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt?
Sure.
When you left the last slide, I lost your video.
Huh, that's weird.
Are you still share it? There you are.
There you go.
Could you?
That's weird. It didn't come back.
Could you just pick it up?
Start?
Just pick it up
Sure.
from when you left the slide.
Okay. Despite the fact that the majority of Jewish women supported suffrage and many individual women, such as the ones that I've just mentioned, played important roles, most American Jewish institutions were slow or hesitant to endorse the suffrage movement because of the anti-Semitism and xenophobia associated with it. Both anti-Semitism and xenophobia were fairly accepted in much of middle and upper class American society at that time, so of course it made its way into the suffrage movement as well. Also, after the break among suffragists and abolitionists in the wake of the 15th Amendment, which enfranchised black men but not women of any race, the suffrage movement sometimes employed racist strategies to court the support of Southern women, emphasizing the need for white women to vote to outweigh the political influence of black men and of the quote-unquote unwashed immigrants. So those tactics also distanced Jews. That said, Jewish institutions were very much engaged in conversation around and support of suffrage, even if they didn't officially endorse the amendment. Synagogues and Jewish women's groups invited prominent suffragists to speak. Sometimes these were the first women to speak from the pulpit. And the American Jewish press held many roundtables and articles on suffrage, mostly in support of it. When the suffrage amendment was ratified and women's suffrage became federal law, Jewish women voted in large numbers and continued to be active in political and communal issues. They also brought that sense of their newfound right into the Jewish community, pointing out that if women could vote in American elections, perhaps they should also have a vote in the synagogue and a seat on synagogue boards. Finally, I think it's essential to acknowledge that the ratification of the 19th Amendment did not mean the end of the voting rights struggle. Far from it. Native American women and Asian women were excluded from coverage of the 19th Amendment because they were not yet considered citizens or eligible for citizenship in 1920. And African American women in the South, though legally enfranchised, were effectively disenfranchised by Jim Crow laws for another 45 years. Among the many, many political issues that Jewish women engaged in after 1920 was the issue of civil rights and voting rights, becoming an important part of the civil rights movement, especially in the 1950s and 60s. Just as the struggle for voting rights endures, so does that legacy. Thank you so much. I am so glad that I had the chance to speak with you and look forward to our continuing conversation. And if you're interested in learning more about Jewish women in the suffrage movement, please go to the Jewish Women's Archive at jwa.org. Thank you.
That was very interesting, Judith. Excellent job.
Thank you. I'm mute myself now.
I'm going to pick it up and talk about Worcester's first women voters, talk about the women's rights movement with a focus on Worcester, and centering on three moments. And I'm going to show a slideshow here. Okay, so focusing on Worcester, and particularly three moments. So the 1850 First National Women's Rights Convention held in Worcester, the school committee elections, first in 1868, and then in 1879, when women were first allowed to register and to vote on school committee elections, and then 1910s revitalized suffrage movement and women's activism at that point. So my emphasis is really on the organizing and networking and the importance of that for women activists, because it was through organizing and networking that women were able to achieve any of their aims that they would never have been able to do by themselves as individuals. So I have a few pictures here, and I'm just going to go through them. But in 1850, the inspiration of the Women's Rights Convention in Worcester carried on locally. This is a picture of Burnley Hall on Main Street, where 1,000 people came for the events. And probably the most important piece to remember is this demand in 1850 for equality before the law without distinction of sex or color. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it really demonstrates that early on, this demand for equality, for racial justice, was really a part of the early women's rights movement. Just a few of the key players. Abby Kelly Foster is well known in Worcester. She was one of the organizers of the 1850 convention, and she's known for her 1851 speech, "Bloody feet, sisters, have worn smooth the path by which you come up hither." Lucy Stone was another organizer, and she was just getting started in her career as a public speaker. Sojourner Truth came in 1850. She was a freed slave from New York. She was selling her book, her narrative of her life up to that point. One of the quotes from her was, "Woman set the world wrong by eating the forbidden fruit, and now she's going to set it right." Ernestine Rose, who was mentioned, was there as well in 1850, and she advocated for the rights of women of the world, political, legal, and social equality with man. These are just some of the people that were on the stage in 1850. Their demands included freedom and opportunity for all women, including freedom for slave women, and, as was mentioned before, equality before the law without distinction of sex or color. And these were their formal demands that were voted on and approved by the voting people at the meeting, which included men and women. After the Civil War, so I'm jumping ahead, after the Civil War, the women's rights movement, such as it was before, splintered into many different organized pro-woman movements, including women's suffrage. So our focus here is more on women's suffrage, but there were a number of different pro-woman, or as would be said later, feminist groups that were formed and pursued various agendas. They wouldn't have used the word feminist at that time. 1868, just to put this into context, the New England Women's Suffrage Association was formed in Boston. And so suffrage means the vote. Women's suffrage movement was organized, and in Worcester, they held many public meetings on Mechanics Hall on Main Street. That year, 1868, the first women were elected to Worcester School Committee. And this is before women could vote. The men voters voted for two women. One of them was Ann B. Earl, and the other was Frances Baker. And it wasn't until 1879 when certain qualified women were allowed to vote in local school committee elections only. Some women, notably Abby Kelly Foster, never registered to vote for the qualified school committee elections because she felt that was not good enough, that wasn't enough. But many women did register to vote for the first time. And this is just a picture of two of the pages from the voter registration book in Worcester. And it's very interesting because really women are representing themselves in public in a new way by signing the voter registration book. This was a milestone for the women who qualified, and qualified generally meant property owning, therefore paying property taxes or paying a poll tax, demonstrating that their citizenship. They could also qualify based on their father's or their husband's papers at that time. So when they registered to vote, they had to indicate their age, their residence, their occupation, their birthplace, and this is something new for women. It's not a lot of women, but the first woman who signed her name and registered was Ann B. Earl, and it lists her age as 63. Her residence is 40 Summer Street, Ward 2, occupation housekeeper. And if you could see this list up close, you would see that the vast majority of the women who registered put their occupation down as housekeeper. She was born in Newport, Rhode Island, and she qualifies by paying property tax. So she was of that class of women, rare, who owned property. It doesn't mention in here that she was an elected official. She was voted to serve on the school committee in 1868. So I wanted to say something about, who are these women, a little bit more about them. So the vast majority of the women who registered to vote in 1879 did list housekeeper as their occupation. 18 listed teacher as their occupation. 4 indicated physician, and 2 identified themselves as students, including 22-year-old Mary E. Whipple on Oriad Street, next to the Oriad Institute, a women's college that no longer exists. Also among the occupations the women listed were one each of the following: artist, author, bookkeeper, dressmaker, ex-teacher, fur repairer, librarian, assistant librarian, and nurse. And one woman in her late 20s classified herself as a, quote, lady. The youngest on the list were 2 teachers, Estella Coes and Arabella Burgess, both age 21, and the oldest were age 75, Mary W. Upham and Joanna K. Ballou. Most of the women, that was 101 out of 162, were in their 40s and 50s. In contrast to the more grand visions put forward by Julia Ward Howe, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, for women gaining very exalted positions in this world, which they hoped would be true someday. This voter registration offers a more prosaic view of the mostly middle-aged woman for whom suffrage mattered. So I think that this shows, it demonstrates that some of the women in Worcester really wanted to vote and felt that it was very important and put themselves out there publicly. Also in the late 19th century, as suffrage was gaining ground, there were many other pro-woman groups formed by women to solve various problems, including women's suffrage. The YWCA for working women, for recreation. They were concerned with opportunities for women in a more informal sense downtown, and the Women's Club for self-development. The Women's Club in Worcester was inspired by the 1850 convention, and they wanted to create an organization that was more up to date in 1880 to focus on the status of women, self-development, and community action. So again, working on organization and networking with other similar women's organizations in other cities around the country in order to gain that voice and that foothold. The Women's Club seen here, as it still exists near Lincoln Square, is a three-sided building built by Josephine Wright Chapman, a woman architect in 1902. 1885, the YWCA also built a building, and that was for their programs and also for housing. Black women-led organizations in Worcester during the Civil War and towards the end. Elizabeth Mowbray led the creation of the Colored Freedmen's Aid Society. And then later in the century, Women's Progressive Club and the Lucy Stone Club were organized by Black women to serve the needs of aged colored women they felt were not being served by the white-led organizations, and homeless girls of the colored race, as they said, to meet the needs of the Black community in Worcester. Then, this is the third moment, is the revitalization of the suffrage movement in Worcester. So all of these things are going on, but in 1912, a new generation of feminists really start to push for the vote. And in Worcester, the new organization is called the Worcester Equal Franchise Club. And this is just an image of a symbol of, victory that they were hoping for. In 1915, there was the state campaign in Massachusetts, and that failed. This is an anti-suffrage ad. Massachusetts men did not vote for women's suffrage that year, and this just shows a pro-woman suffrage ad. So it was a very difficult campaign, defeated. After 1916, Worcester suffragists joined with the national organizations to push for women's suffrage, but there was a very strong anti-suffrage group in Worcester as well, and they opposed the further extension of suffrage. So it seemed that they were okay with women voting on school committee, but no more than that. And they worked just as hard. It was a very bitter fight. The 19th Amendment, was ratified in 1920, finally. And the quote of the amendment says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." It left racial discrimination in place, and so it was not as full a victory as would have been hoped. So bringing it to a conclusion, thinking about yesterday and today, and what may be learned is that the organization and networking is really key. By organizing, women could really amplify their voices and accomplish what they wanted to do, but could never do as individuals. And we maybe can think about that and how organizations can function today. So even when they disagreed on some issues, such as suffrage, they could work together on other shared goals. Another thought for today, that perhaps disagreeing on certain political agendas can be set aside sometimes to work on a shared goal. And so I would just emphasize that organization and networks are still key to women's political action today. And also another key point here is that racial and gender equality have been part of this story from the beginning. So the 1850 Women's Rights Convention shows that some activists were willing to demand racial and gender equality from the start, and that this was an explosive demand. And perhaps the explosiveness of this demand is what really launched the women's rights movement. The Worcester Women's History Project was organized in 1995 to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the 1850 Women's Rights Convention and to revisit those issues, and that created the Women 2000 Conference. So I thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you some of this about Worcester and the suffrage movement.
Thank you all for the opportunity to moderate such an important conversation. I'm honored to be in the presence of so many incredible women and to learn more about the fight to vote. I wanted to start with the first question. Why is it important for us to commemorate the women's right to vote today? Dr. Cook, would you like to go first?
Okay, thank you for that question. I think that just kind of going back to what I finished with saying at the end there, that it's important for us to see what people have done and accomplished, what women have accomplished in the past. And I think it's very important to see how organization and networks really played a role, and that is still important today.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Sorry.
No.
Yeah, I was really struck with your conclusion when you said, today it's just as important for women to organize and to be able to make sure that we are kind of on the same page about these things. So I thought that was really striking and super important to remember from a grassroots perspective. So thank you for that. Dr. Rosenbaum.
Yeah, so, I think it's really important to remember that for all its incompleteness, the suffrage movement still had a huge impact, right? It basically doubled the electorate, and this had an enormous impact on women's lives and on politics, and also is really part of the continued unfolding of the democratic ideal, right? The 19th Amendment helped America come one step closer to living up to its founding promise. And so that's a big deal. It's definitely not finished, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't celebrate the wins. And I think it's particularly important if we want to continue to make change, we have to understand how change happened. And so if we lose the history, we can't do that. We can't learn from it if we don't commemorate the movements and the wins along the way. So I'm a big believer in the importance of telling the stories. I would say commemoration, not just celebration, because we need to learn from the successes and from the failures.
Thank you. Beautifully said. And we really do, in history class, we really do spend so much time making sure that kids understand that the past is super important. So our next question is, what are 3 lessons that we can learn from the movement today when countless citizens are still disenfranchised and still fighting for this right and access to the polls? Dr. Rosenbaum, would you like to take that one?
Sure. So there are so many lessons I think we can learn from this movement because it was such a long movement. But so one lesson I think we've already kind of referred to, which is that democracy is never a finished product or fully achieved. It's always unfolding, and it always needs to be carefully protected and promoted. We have to keep pursuing it, and we can't get complacent. We can't think like, oh, we've accomplished that. I mean, we see this fairly recently, right, in that much of what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 accomplished was undone in 2013 by the Supreme Court. So we see that there are constant, steps forward and steps back. So that's one lesson, I think, just about kind of the ongoing process of democracy. The second lesson I would say, and this is one that really inspires me about the suffrage movement, is perseverance. I mean, as we already said, this was a movement of more than 7 decades. So it's kind of amazing, right? That kind of dedication, that kind of staying power. I think we have a lot to learn in that. Don't let despair knock you off track. Keep going, even if you're not going to see the end, to know that you're fighting for something and that there will be other people who will come after you and pick up and continue the fight. And then the third thing I would say that a lesson that I take from the movement is that to make social change, you need to pursue many different strategies, and you need to be able to work within coalitions of many different kinds of people. And that we have to be really careful not to let those coalitions be undermined by our differences, whether those are practical differences or whether those are ideological differences. You don't have to agree on everything to work together. And I think we learned that from the places where the suffrage movement was effective and where people did work together. And we also learned it from the places where they failed and let differences of approach or opinion undermine some of their collaboration. So, I definitely think that the suffrage movement helps remind us that we shouldn't let those in power turn us against our allies, as happened, with suffragists and abolitionists over the 15th Amendment. So I think there's a lot to learn there, both about what strategies worked in this long movement and also about where some of the missteps and failures were.
Yeah, and I think that even today with the Organization for Social Movements currently happening, we are seeing a lot of these organizational strategies play out in a way that have been successful. So, or will hopefully be successful. Thank you for that. Dr. Cook.
Thanks. Those were great, Judith. So I'm not sure what I can add to that, except to just say perhaps that, voting is not the only way to participate. I think that's a lesson from those days, that women who were not allowed to vote were able to be politically active and successful in many different ways, and to get their voice out there. So to just think about that, not to get voting is important, and everybody please vote. But that's definitely not the only way to get your message out there and to participate politically. And so, if you think about back in 1850, the way to have a public conversation was to all be in a room together. And so the bigger the room, the more people could participate. And here we are now in 2020, talking through our computer screens, so things have changed in terms of technology. So I would say, it's the organizing and the networking that counts, and use the technology and the tools of our time to amplify the demands, and that those things are important. The First Amendment is very important, right? Speech and the freedom of the press and freedom to assemble. Those things are really important.
Yes, it's insane how fast content and organizing strategies and posters, all these different kinds of things get out on the internet so quickly. So people are really using social media as a means to get things done today. So it's really fascinating to see that change over time. In our last question.
Can I jump in before we get to the last question? Because I really appreciate what you said, Lisa. I think, that thinking creatively about the technology that we use now, but also learning from the ways that people were able to organize even before they had those technologies is really important, because sometimes the technologies that we have also can get in the way, right? Like one of the things we know with social media, it makes it so much easier to reach people, but it also sometimes narrows our conversation so that we're only talking to people who are already, in our networks, or already agree with us, or, and I think what you were saying, Lisa, about just people gathering together, large groups of people who may not have agreed, and the kinds of conversations, which sometimes were very, heated, even bordering on violent, but there's something really important about the opportunity for people to gather and hear different kinds of perspectives. And it was much harder in some ways for that to happen then. When I think about all the work that went into gathering signatures on petitions, before, let alone the internet, before there were typewriters, before there were Xerox machines, right? It's kind of mind-blowing. But also just to remember that sometimes it's the face-to-face and the willingness to engage in conversations that are difficult conversations that we need to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just brings to mind thinking about the fact that in Worcester at that time, in the mid-19th century, it was a railroad hub. So it was a place that was, you were talking about how difficult it might be to organize people to get together in groups, and being a railroad hub with a lot of different lines meant that it was just that much, a little bit easier for people to come from various cities, to Worcester at that time. Yeah.
And that's a really great segue to our last question. How did Worcester or Massachusetts, on a general scale, play a role in the movement? Dr. Cook, would you like to take that first?
Sure. I guess I did, pretty much step on that question. The railroad hub.
Right.
That was definitely key. Of course, pretty close to Boston, which was also, a place that people could gather, and only a little short train ride away from Boston. Worcester was a place where the issue of anti-slavery and racial equality was already percolating. Not to say that everybody in Worcester was anti-slavery or anti-racist, but there was a contingent. Abby Kelly Foster and her husband and others in the community were already in that fight. And so the women's rights movement was something that they definitely wanted to latch on to. And then later, Worcester and Massachusetts are going to be part of a much bigger network across the country of various kinds of pro-women activism. So instead of being sort of one hub for gathering, their, I think, strength and power came from being a part of larger networks. So that's what I would say about that.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenbaum.
I'm not sure I have much to add about Worcester and Massachusetts, but I'll sort of add the flip side, which is that sometimes we forget that actually women got the right to vote first in the Western states, which were newer members of the Union and therefore didn't have the same traditions and rules and kind of exclusions. There were fewer people, and so they just needed people to be more involved, and things were a little bit looser. And so I think that's important too. Sometimes those of us, I think, in the Northeast assume that everything, starts and ends here. And in some ways that's true. I think, places that have a strong press and that have lots of people together, there's a lot of energy that happens there. But I think it's also important to remember that some of the really interesting stories about suffrage and some of the kind of early, most radical suffrage battles happened out west.
Very true.
I think the first state was Wyoming to approve women's right to vote, I believe. So that's pretty cool, yeah. But anyway, so thank you for this incredibly important and enlightening conversation. As Dr. Rosenbaum had said, we spend a lot of time, I teach my students that in order for us to make better decisions for the future, we must understand our past. And we're honoring that by continuing the conversation and by exercising our hard-fought right to vote. We encourage you to make sure you have a plan set in place to vote by November 3rd, 2020. Thank you so much for everyone's time, and this was amazing. Take care.
I would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Dr. Judith Rosenbaum and Dr. Lisa Connolly Cook for generously sharing your time and expertise. Thank you both for illuminating the historical significance of the fight for suffrage and the enduring struggle, and for helping us commemorate the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women the right to vote. Thank you to Serena Lapin for your amazing questions and for moderating this program. Thank you to the City of Worcester Cable Services, Jessica Jakes, for making this recording possible. The Worcester Senior Center and the Worcester JCC have a long history of collaboration. I would like to thank Suki Lapin for being a programming partner extraordinaire, as well as a trusted colleague and dear friend. I think it is only fitting to end with a quote from the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Real change, enduring change happens one step at a time. Thank you. This was an amazing program, all.